How are you, Emmanuel?
Doing good, thank you.
Nice to see you.
Welcome. I think we're ready to start. So I want to welcome all the people attending this talk this evening about Beethoven. We're specifically focusing on the works on the Bard Conservatory Orchestra's concert on May 8th, their final concert of the season. It includes the Beethoven Symphonies number 3 and 4, his, I guess, somewhat rarely played Wellington's Victory Overture, and even more rarely played the dry Equale for 4 trombones. I'm joined this evening by 3 of my esteemed colleagues, by first of all, Christopher Gibbs, who's the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Music History. He is also the artistic co-director of the Bard Music Festival. He's an author, including of my favorite 1-volume history of music book. I'm also joined by Emmanuel Dongala, who is the Professor Emeritus at Bard College at Simon's Rock, where he was the Richard B. Fisher Chair in Natural Sciences. Emmanuel is a man of many talents. He's a chemist by training. He's also a writer of fiction and poetry. He's a winner of the Guggenheim Fellowship. He's here this evening specifically because he wrote his most recent novel called The Bridgetower Sonata, details the fascinating story of George Bridgetower, who was 18th century Black violinist who made quite a splash in Europe and had a relationship with Beethoven, and Beethoven dedicated his, what we now call the Kreutzer Sonata, to George Bridgetower, and then they had a falling out and he withdrew that dedication. But I want to hear more about that fascinating chapter in Beethoven's life. And then finally, of course, Leon Botstein, who's the president of Bard College and the music director of both the Orchestra Now and the Bard Conservatory Orchestra, and the conductor of this coming concert on May 8th. Leon, I wanted to start first with you, perhaps. I was wondering how, it's been a trying year for all orchestras, but particularly for you and our 2 orchestras here. It's been a complicated year, and I'm wondering why you decided to finish this year with these 2 concerts celebrating Beethoven, and what led you specifically to the works on this program.
So first I want to thank you and Christopher and Emmanuel for joining this conversation. The answer to your question is pretty simple. So it was many-sided set of circumstances that brought us to make the decision. First of all, certain repertoire became impossible because of the space limitations, because of social distancing and mask wearing, and particularly for the winds and brass. The size of an ensemble you can get into a single hall is limited. And also the restrictions of the number of people who can be in a space under COVID. So a full symphony orchestra, you couldn't do a late romantic work, which had a lot of lower brass, a lot of percussion, more than double winds. It was tight, and also could bear the much smaller string section. So you couldn't do, I don't know, a Tchaikovsky symphony or something like that, or much less most of the 20th century repertoire, Shostakovich symphony or something like that. The other thing is that we had planned to do something that would celebrate Beethoven's birthday in 2020, and that celebration got essentially canceled by COVID. And in a conservatory, part of the obligation you have is to introduce students both to new repertory and to things they normally wouldn't come across, but also some encounter with what we call the standard repertory. That should be in everybody's, I would say, history of experience. As an actor, learning the basic parts of the Shakespeare roles, whether it be Ophelia or Desdemona or Lear or Hamlet, it's sort of that kind of relationship to their training. So Beethoven's just a core of the repertoire. Then we also decided we would use players we couldn't use. So Wellington's Victory came in mind because there's a fair amount of percussion. There's the English, military, and then there's the French military. And then, in a battle symphony like that, which is simply a description of, this battle and the victory, the purists, can take a lunch break, and so we can actually use tubas, we can double the parts. Nobody's going to call foul play, like, no referee is going to come and say, how can you do that? So we have tubas playing, we have everything but the kitchen sink. We used everybody we could possibly use. And it's the only really, shamelessly vulgar piece Beethoven probably published. It's not quite as bad as people make it out to be. And it's sort of fun. And it is what the 18th century was used to, entertainments which told the story of a battle. And there's the Battle of Vittoria, where Wellington defeats the Napoleonic armies. And, you hear Rule Britannia and God Save the King and all that. It's clearly Beethoven, but it's Beethoven, with, not paying a lot of attention and obviously in a big hurry. And although, it was in its time, it's not nearly as bad as the people who write about it think it is, but it's a lot of fun, and I think the orchestra enjoys doing it because it's something they really didn't know. And the fourth and the third symphonies, the third symphony has to be one of the really landmarks of orchestral music. And the fourth is, if any Beethoven symphony can be said to be underrepresented, you probably are looking at 2, 4, and 8, probably are the least well represented in the repertory. And 4 is a particularly interesting and charming and very impressive.
It's a wonderful piece.
Haydn-esque symphony, yeah. So that's about the reason.
Yeah,
It's a great experience for everyone.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It's a wonderful program. Christopher and Emmanuel, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Eroica Symphony, and also this interesting, it's sort of dueling falling out, or dueling this pair of contentious relationships that Beethoven seemed to have, or relationships that he broke. First of all, with the Eroica, taking away the dedication to Napoleon, and then certainly in the Kreutzer Sonata, what we call the Kreutzer Sonata, taking away the dedication to George Bridgetower. Christopher, can you go into how did this come about that he dedicated this piece to Napoleon, and what was the driving idea behind that?
Well, he very much initially admired Napoleon, and he was writing this heroic symphony that he was going to call Bonaparte. And then became disillusioned when Napoleon crowned himself, and Beethoven felt this pointed potentially to tyranny and so forth. So he changed it to, officially the title was Heroic Symphony, written to celebrate the memory of a great man. So it takes away the literal figure there and is more many maybe heroes. But in a letter he said, really the title is Bonaparte, and he never withdrew the sort of inspiration of this particular heroic figure. The last movement makes reference to Prometheus, so to a Greek Titan and another heroic figure. But a work as well that has been connected in some ways to Beethoven himself as a hero in this, because it comes at a crucial time in his life, in his early 30s, when he's acknowledging that for the first time that he's losing his hearing. takes quite some time for really the full implications of this, that he really can't hear anything, can't perform, but he sees that this deterioration. And this symphony is a turning point in his career, from what had been modeled on his sort of hero Mozart, and literally his teacher Haydn, and now going, as he called, in a new path. And that's the way it was initially received as well. It premiered officially. There were some private performances in 1805. And the reaction in the press is fascinating to look, because the same words keep on coming up, that it is so long, that it's so difficult to play, it's so challenging for the musicians. A word that keeps on coming up is bizarre, same in German as in English. That it's original, that it's sublime rather than beautiful. And these words come so many times, it's clear that a lot of people just couldn't believe a symphony could last this long, or
He was
be
really
so
breaking
difficult to play.
he was sort of breaking the boundaries of what was possible, I suppose.
Yeah, it's just, you know, the expectations at the time were being quite broken with this. What's fascinating is it doesn't take too many years before critics are commenting that the orchestra was playing this with obvious love and enthusiasm. There's one review that says they had voluntarily done extra rehearsals without pay. So already,
and you know, it's bad when musicians work without pay.
Sort of the world that Leon knows all too well. And so, you know, it doesn't take long for this to become not only a key change in the history of the symphony, but a beloved piece as well.
Yeah, and it seems like, Emmanuel, there seems to be a kind of parallel story with the Kreutzer Sonata, which in its own right broke the bounds for the violin sonata, piano and violin sonata. It really, I think it is the longest, I believe, of all the of Beethoven's piano and violin sonatas. And certainly in kind of expressive scope, it is. It has a kind of drama and expressive intensity, which, you know, inspired Tolstoy's story. And, you know, it's really, it's quite impactful. And you detail this interesting relationship that, it's very similar to the Eroica Symphony in that way, but it also has this interesting relationship with the dedicatee who is withdrawn, a dedication which is withdrawn with George Bridgetower. Can you talk about the relationship between George Bridgetower and Beethoven and how it developed and what happened? How did they fall out?
Okay. Just before I start, just a very quick word. I'm very privileged and humbled and flattered to participate to this platform, especially with President Botstein, whose authority really brought me here out of civil war in the Congo, where I could have lost my life. So thank you again. Okay. This said, yes, there are so many parallels between the Kreutzer Sonata and the Eroica, which maybe people don't talk much about it, because first of all, Beethoven was writing the Eroica in 1803, 1804, and the Kreutzer Sonata in 1803. In other words, he was working on the Eroica when he decided to write that sonata for George Bridgetower. In other words, he interrupted the writing his Kreutzer. So we just said that this Heroica was a turning point. We were this new, really revolutionary way of writing, you know, moving away from Haydn and Mozart. And he brought that energy in the Kreutzer, right, while writing the Kreutzer Sonata. In other words, he was in the same state of mind when he was writing the Bonaparte Symphony and the Kreutzer Sonata. And another thing, another link between the two is that in his mind, usually when he dedicated, I don't know, pieces to some of his patrons, he was writing for the music. But in the case of the Kreutzer, of the Bridgetower Sonata, Kreutzer Sonata, he was really writing for George. He had it in mind. And, you know, the voice of George Bridgetower is all over that sonata, you know, the passion, the technical difficulties, because he was a prodigy. That's why. And so, I mean, without George Bridgetower, I don't think the Kreutzer Sonata would be what it is. And then to come to the dedicated, okay, and then another common thing they have is that the Eroica, as we just heard, was first dedicated to Napoleon and withdrawn. Same thing, it was first dedicated, the Kreutzer were dedicated to George Bridgetower. As a matter of fact, the first title was Sonata Mulatica, and he dedicated in jest to Sonata Mulatica for these crazy mulatto, because they were calling mulatto then people who were here. These days we would say mixed race, because he had a black father and a Polish mother. So it was Sonata Mulatica. However, the big difference between the two is that today, when you play the Eroica, even though Beethoven withdrew the dedication to Bonaparte, Napoleon, and later dedicated to one of his patrons, Prince Lobkowitz. But when you play the Eroica, everybody knows that the name of Napoleon is really connected to that Eroica. However, nobody knows that the name of Bridgetower is connected to the Kreutzer Sonata. Not at all, it's completely forgotten. So that's the two differences. But, so you see, there are really a lot of subtle links between those two works, those two masterpieces.
How did Beethoven and George Bridgetower meet? Was he touring, or how did they come to know each other?
Bridgetower, well, he was a young prodigy. He started in Paris at age 9. He really conquered Paris. And then when the revolution came, they fled to England. And there, the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, noticed him, and he really took him in his wing, and he was good, very good. And but then he wanted to go see his mother on the continent. And so he went to Dresden, where his mother was. But then they told him, oh, George, you have to go to Vienna. That's where the action is. And, oh, by the way, he had, when he was a kid, his father was at Esterházy, Prince Esterházy in Hungary. And so he had lessons from Haydn. This is just, yeah.
So you could say that both Beethoven and George Bridgetower were students of Haydn in a way.
Yeah. So the funny thing is that in England, when they were advertising concert by Bridgetower, they always wrote a pupil of Haydn. And when Haydn came to London, they played together. And so, I mean, there's really something common between him and Beethoven. Okay, let me go back. So he goes to Dresden. They told him, you have to go to Vienna. That's where the action is. So he went to Vienna, and he had a letter of recommendation for a prince called Ludwig, who also brought Beethoven from Bonn to Vienna. And so Ludwig introduced him to Beethoven, and immediately just clicked. And because both of them thought they were a little the margin of the society, because you have this mulatto guy, very uncommon, and this Beethoven who was very, not very beautiful, he was short and swarthy, and when he was young, they used to call him the Black Spanish, So they really clicked together, and then they say, okay, we have to play, have to write a sonata and play together.
So they were really friends in a way.
Oh yeah, they were very friends. They were crazy together and drinking together, chasing women together, even though Beethoven was not very successful with women. But the strange thing is that this intense friendship lasted only 3 months. Can you imagine? Mm. And it gave this masterpiece, the Kreutzer Sonata. And it's strange how in art, a small, intense moment can lead to really unforgettable masterpiece.
Yeah, it's incredible. How did they end up falling out?
Well, it's a very stupid story, because one of the biographers of Beethoven tell the story that when George was old, the biographer went to visit him. I think it's in Thayer's biography, I don't remember. And George told him a stupid story about a woman. So the story goes that after the breaking up, the falling out came out very quickly after they played the Kreutzer Sonata. So they were celebrating, and George made a very disparaging remark about a woman which Beethoven was in love with. Well, he was in love with so many women, but at that time, the people believed that it was Giulietta Guicciardi, the one for whom Beethoven wrote that sonata, which these days is called Moonlight Sonata, which was not the original title. So he made a disparaging remark about her, and Beethoven, as you know, very mercurial, he got mad, and then that's it. That was it. And they never see each other again. And by the way, people ask often why he dedicated it to Kreutzer. Well, Beethoven, who could talk to Prince, was very, independent and all that, very proud. But sometimes to compromise and to court favor, because when he was courting all these women, especially Giulietta, he was trying to make people believe that his fan, V-A-N, the Dutch, was equivalent to the von, the Aristotle von, which was not true. But he tried to play with that. And why did he dedicate it to Kreutzer? Simply, very opportunistic. He wanted to go to Paris. He wanted to give the premiere of the Bonaparte in Paris, and to court favor for Parisian audience. Kreutzer then was the most famous violinist at the time and very influential. So he dedicated to him. But unfortunately, Kreutzer didn't like the piece at all. And Berlioz wrote in his memoir, I read when I was doing the research, Berlioz wrote that Kreutzer thought that Beethoven didn't know, how did he put it, has no idea how to write a sonata, and he never played it. Kreutzer never played it, and without this dedication, who would remember Kreutzer today, except maybe for his capriccios and etudes, which stood at Barrio. And
so it was really.
And the last thing I want to say, and the last thing, last thing I want to say is that this Kreutzer Sonata was so important that it inspired Tolstoy, who wrote the Kreutzer Sonata about that, and the Tolstoy Kreutzer Sonata inspired a Czech composer, Janacek, who also wrote a Kreutzer Sonata, but this time based on the book.
Serial connection, yeah. Yeah, it's great. It's great. So, so his dedication to Kreutzer was purely opportunistic in a certain way, and it maybe is a good segue to Wellington's Victory, which I have to confess to you all, when I was a student in conservatory, my music history teacher said, that's the worst piece Beethoven ever wrote. Don't listen to it. He never should have written it. So, Christopher, I have to ask you, as a music history teacher yourself, is it a bad piece? Was my old music history teacher correct, or?
It's a fun piece, and it points to what Leon mentioned, that this was very, very popular. And so frequently performed, and it made Beethoven money. But already at the time, there were objections and critics that were saying that Beethoven was really degrading himself with this. And one review in a very prominent journal, Beethoven annotates in his handwriting. So this is, you know, real news, not fake news. He's very vivid about it, so I won't use the exact language, but my excrement is better than anything you have ever thought.
Yeah.
That's his response to this critic who's saying that it's a bad piece. So it's been something of an embarrassment in the Beethoven literature ever since, but it's fun. It influenced Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, which also has battles represented by different tunes, and you know, we hear on the 4th of July. This we don't hear so much. So you know, on Saturday will be an opportunity to actually figure it out a bit.
Yeah. So Leon, do you think that Beethoven wrote this for a paycheck, or do you think he had other motives in mind?
I think, you know, I think Emmanuel said rightly, Beethoven was a very strange and peculiar person, and very quick-tempered, and he also had whims, and he also was concerned about his financial standing. And as Emmanuel rightly says, he had this strange notion that he wanted to be, when he tried to get control of his nephew, and he wanted to have his court proceedings take place in the court for the aristocracy, and they're using the fon, as Emmanuel suggests, as a fon and so forth. He was a complicated, odd guy, and so I rather think he did it to curry popularity and to make money. It's a very effective piece. It's not that long, so it doesn't wear out its welcome, and I see no reason to apologize for it. I think, you know, classical music is always in danger, needs to be protected from its protectors. You know, its defenders are its worst enemies, and so this needs a lot of fun. It's adorable. It's clearly Beethoven. It's, you know, it's kind of a throwaway piece, and people are entitled for throwaway pieces. Interesting. I wanted to say that. So we growing up knew. Emmanuel was right. We knew something about Bridgetower. We knew that he existed, and we knew that something happened. But with more than that, we never knew. And he's absolutely right. I mean, everybody knows Kreutzer because Rudolf Kreutzer wrote the sort of first, you know, step in the long climb to develop a violin technique. So Jack Benny, you know, Jack Benny made a fortune, who was a very good violinist, playing the opening exercise in the 24, you know, studies and caprices for violin by Rudolf Kreutzer. And Rudolf Kreutzer was a kind of typical musician of the time, and Emmanuel is right. This Kreutzer Sonata is a, like the Eroica, is a boundary breaking. Tchaikovsky actually orchestrated the exposition of
I didn't know that.
movement. Yes.
Really?
So yes, Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky orchestrated the Kreutzer Sonata.
Was that an exercise, or was he going to do the whole
no
piece?
one really knows. We actually performed it. I've actually done it, and it stops, I think, at the end of the exposition. He never completed it, but it's an interesting idea. It's only to suggest that this is a piece that, I think Emmanuel's right, has a kind of imaginary sonority of the piano and the violin, you know, that is, and that's why it is sort of, it's identified with passion, and with frenzy. It's Dionysian, and it is, it's a fantastic piece, and he's right. It has the same, you know, flight of imagination, which is uniquely Beethoven's, from the same period. But I never apologize for the second time I've done Wellington's Victory in the Public. I've had fun now. I had fun before. I find snobs a bore. This thing is a gas, ratchets, cannons, It's a riot.
Yeah, I went to the rehearsal last week, and I have to say I loved it. I thought it was really fun. You know, it's like, I had a great
I
time.
mean, really, there's nothing to apologize for. If
Yeah.
this had been the only thing he ever wrote,
Well, that's it.
we probably would never know about Beethoven, but it isn't.
And of course, there's a long tradition of these kinds of pieces. I
Oh,
think
yes.
most composers, and I think actually, Leon, you've done probably all of them. I would
No,
imagine.
no, he's also, but the other thing is that but it's interesting, it benefits from his other work. I mean, you clearly know that it's Beethoven. It isn't, the neighbor down the street. It's clearly Beethoven. Because, he does it in a way with his left hand. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Christopher, one last quick question. Do you think, is the Eroica the first work by Beethoven? I've never thought about this. Is it really the first work by Beethoven that kind of shows him as the revolutionary in a way? I mean, the early piano sonatas are quite conservative in some ways. The early string quartets in their own way are quite conservative. Is the Eroica really the first one, or are there other works of Beethoven around this time that also,
if one goes by the reviews, and many of them are anonymous, or but they may be written by idiots, but I'm always interested to see what the reactions were. And beginning with the First Symphony, that the first chord is unexpected and its resolution, critics comment about that immediately. And some of the reviews of the Second Symphony, you would think, are about the Eroica. So these things were initially fairly shocking, because Haydn had written over 100 symphonies and Mozart some 50, and Beethoven is already testing the limits and going in new directions. What happens with the Eroica and later works, is really, really shocking. And then his late style, the late quartets and the Ninth Symphony and so forth, that actually does take quite some time for musicians and audiences and critics to assimilate.
Yeah.
But Christopher, wouldn't you say, I mean, I'm curious what you think. So I happen to agree with the implicit argument in Frank's question. I've always thought the Eroica is one step, just like the Kreutzer. I mean, all the previous violin sonatas, there's a C minor sonata, which is terrific. I mean, it's a really fantastic piece. But the Kreutzer somehow is in another world. It's a rocket ship to another planet. And there's something absolutely about the Eroica, which is just way out there. And it loses its family resemblance to a Haydn symphony, or even to the Jupiter Symphony.
Right.
Maybe sort of like the Jupiter, maybe, but when you go to the coda of the first movement, and then this maniacal scherzo, and then this theme and variations on the creatures of Prometheus, and the sort of intensity of sonic extremes. You think you've sort of stepped over, like all those science fiction programs where the people step from one world into another, they go through some jelly and they come out the other end. There is something
another dimension,
which is that you have the feeling when you're preparing and performing it that you're walking from, you're crossing a border of some kind.
Do you find it, Leon, hard as a performer, do you find it hard to recapture that feeling for a current audience, that feeling of, shock, without kind of distorting the piece in some sort of artificial way?
It's a good question. I think the Eroica, like the Beethoven Fifth and the Seventh, they're even if people don't, they're in their people's ears in a different way. So the historians have done us a lot of favors by asking us to focus on the original tempos and balances of the instrument, size of the orchestra. So what's fresh, big ponderous Eroica that we grew up with, the kind of Eroica you associate with Klemper or Karajan, or the kind of they arrive already knowing they're in a profound moment. You don't, and in the funeral march, and there's something heavy, it's a lot to digest when you realize that he's, when Strauss, I think, once said that if you think you're not going fast enough, go faster. You had a good idea. But in this case, the Beethoven is crazy. The intensity is crazy. So the 19th century unwound that intensity. And we in the 21st century are trying to put it back together so that what is shocking in the Eroica is the relentlessness of it. It never lets you go, like the Kreutzer Sonata. The Emmanuel, I think you would agree, the Kreutzer Sonata gets a hold on you, and it's like a parasite, and you can't get rid of it. It grabs you, and it's more than entertainment. That's the whole point. It suddenly is shocking enough that it's more than entertainment.
Well, we also do so much worshiping of Beethoven, and we forget that he was all too human. And we forget, that's what I find so compelling about this Bridgetower event is just that it shows the kind of humanity of Beethoven, and that he lived in he had feuds with friends and had loves. And, I think it's really fascinating. I can only imagine, I was thinking of another thing. I can only imagine how horrible these first performances of some of these pieces must have been, because, I know that, for instance, the Kreutzer, I think Bridgetower was reading over Beethoven's shoulder, and sight reading. They hadn't rehearsed or prepared the piece. It must have sounded terrible, I can imagine. And I don't know what the circumstances for the Eroica first performance were, but I can't imagine that it was much better, actually. So I don't know.
That's why they keep on talking about the difficulty and the length, and what Leon just said about entertainment. There's actually one of the early reviews says, you don't always just need to be entertained. It's entering into a new relationship with the symphony and with music. So reviews talk about how one needs repeated hearings, and actually to study the score, and talks about the score itself. That's a different relationship to when Haydn goes to London, and he really needs to entertain the audience at Hanover Square that's going to hear this symphony once. And if they don't like it immediately, he's in some trouble, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. I want to interject just a little with a little housekeeping. We're going to talk for another 5 minutes or so, and I don't want to forget about Beethoven 4 or the Equale. And then we'll have questions and answers with the audience. So if anyone watching this wants to put questions into the question function, please do so along the way, and I'll grab them from there and ask our panelists. We've kind of done to Beethoven's Fourth what I think history has done to it also. So what's great about this piece? Why does it get forgotten, but why should it not be forgotten? Whoever wants, I know Leon or whoever wants to talk about this, I'm happy to.
I am curious what Emmanuel thinks. The piece is, to me, it's a reflection. Composers go back and forth. It's usually said about Strauss, he would write a tragedy, then a comedy, then a tragedy, then a comedy. They didn't do the same thing over and over again. And this is a kind of homage to Haydn. It's a real, it's like a gift to his teacher, and it's very Haydn-esque. It has some of the most Haydn-esque quality to it. So after breaking through to new ground, he got cold feet, decided to go back home, So in a way, it's very there's nothing simple about it, but it does have the character of being affectionately in the style of his teacher.
Emmanuel, I wanted to ask you, as you're a creative artist, a novelist, a poet. Have you found yourself also in this tension between trying to break boundaries and also being more traditional and conservative? Have you found this in your own work?
Yeah,
your life?
All the time. You look for originality, but at the same time, you have to. I don't know, to be understood by your readers. And but actually, I want to ask a question to Leon, though, if I may, because he's talking the fourth, the homage to Haydn. But what do you think of the eighth? It's between the seventh and the ninth, and it's so short. Is it also another, homage to Haydn? Because it's also a
Yes.
yeah.
Well, I think it's a very good question. And by the way, I want to say to Emmanuel, I was so pleased. Emmanuel sent me the French edition of this novel when it came out. And I was so pleased that, which was very optimistic on his part, that I would have the time to read it in French, clawing my way through it. But I was so pleased to see that there was an English translation, which has just come out. And I think probably we should send to all the participants a link to it. Nothing an author likes more than getting his books bought. And now that it's come out in English, I think it's great that, and it's wonderful. And the Eighth Symphony is. So I think Frank asked the right question of you. So let's say you wrote a very big novel, right? A big novel. And before embarking on the next novel, you would think about writing a short story. And the eighth is the short story between 3 novels, 6, 7, and 9. I think that's really, it's a kind of keeping your chops in order. You're not ready to take on another big novel, So you write, do writers think that way? Do you do that?
Oh yeah, sometimes. Yes.
Or write an essay, or you write something short.
Yeah, something, to breathe a little bit, to clear out your mind before you embark into another ambitious work.
Yeah. And I suppose going back and forth between genres can also be helpful if you're writing poetry to write something longer and vice versa.
I'm impressed. The really composers that I admire as a performer, like Haydn or Strauss or Beethoven, they wanted to keep their technique. I remember Emmanuel and I had a common friend. He's in the United States, and we are actually privileged to have him as a colleague all these years because of the intervention of Philip Roth, who was our mutual friend. And Philip always talked about the discipline, he went to work every day and he wrote every morning. And it was not about inspiration. It was about perfecting the craft, counterpoint, thematic development, structure, just like you practice it. You're a pianist, right? You don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to play this. You go, it's painful. And it's a daily routine. So I imagine for a writer, you can't always be working on a big project, but you want to keep your skills as a composer for the orchestra, right? And you want your formal skills, really playing by the rules, can I actually, like a Rubik's Cube, can I work this out well? Can I still do it? I remember Philip Roth stopped writing when he confessed he was going to stop writing because he could no longer keep in his head a long thing. And Saul Bellow, at the end of his career, things got shorter and shorter. So Beethoven might actually have a crisis and can I still do this? And so the way he starts is to write this shortish symphony, compact piece of work before embarking on this or Missa Solemnis or some gigantic project that he has to do.
Yeah, fascinating. That, speaking of short things, Kreuzer, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the Equale, which I have to confess I've never heard before, and they have an interesting place in Beethoven's history. What are they about? Why were they written? And
Yeah, I've never heard them live. The thing that interests me most about them, if you know, these pieces for 4 trombones that he wrote, I think around 1812 or so, is that they were performed at his funeral in March 1827. And this is a point of personal sort of interest that Schubert, who is a composer very dear to me, was one of the torchbearers at this funeral. And these equale were 2 of them, there are 3, were played on like a tape loop, alternating with a sung version of the same piece with the words miserere. And so it's a long walk from the center of Vienna to where the cemetery is in Währing. So Schubert must have heard these a billion times that afternoon. I find this evocative because in his Schubert's final symphony that he was sketching literally on his deathbed, there's very prominent parts for trombones that I think point to these equale. He never finished the symphony, but there's a wonderful version of it that Leon has conducted called Rendering by Luciano Barrio, the great Italian late 20th century composer. And he took these wonderful sketches of Schubert that he didn't want to turn into a fake Schubert symphony, but wanted to make use of it. And so he wrote this 35-minute long piece called Rendering. And if you listen to that, you'll hear these moments for trombones that are very prominent and that may harken back to Schubert hearing this on the sort of tape loop at Beethoven's funeral.
Another change.
But let me ask you, I'm as curious as Frank. But clearly he didn't write them for his own funeral. There must have been, does anybody know why he got involved in this project to do it?
Yeah, I don't know what going back to, 1812 or whatever it was.
Money?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. This kind of serial chain is really fascinating. The serial chain of influence is really fascinating. Actually, I was wondering, Emmanuel, if this is I have no idea what the answer. I have no idea if this is even a valid question, but so the Kreutzer Sonata inspired the Tolstoy story, which inspired the Janáček string quartet. And I'm wondering if you yourself were inspired by Beethoven, by either the Kreutzer Sonata or by Beethoven's music in other ways in your own writing.
What I can say is that my interest for the Kreutzer Sonata was also aroused by reading Tolstoy, because what I heard, I didn't know anything about the Kreutzer Symphony, but I read the book before, and what on the radio when they talk about, they say the Kreutzer Symphony was originally written for a forgotten violinist, and then Kreutzer Sonata, the Kreutzer Sonata, Kreutzer, and that my curiosity, got aroused, and yeah, I mean, influences to write the Bridgetower Sonata. Yes, I read a lot. I reread the Kreutzer Sonata by Tolstoy to see, because it's this emotion which comes out of the sonata that pushed Tolstoy to write his story. So I wanted to see what really Tolstoy read into that sonata. Yes, and it helped.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of this, but I do find your writing similar to Tolstoy in the kind of clarity of characterization of the various personalities in the novel. I think it's really interesting. I didn't realize. Is Tolstoy an influence for your own writing? Do you find him someone that has?
Yeah, I love Tolstoy. Yes.
Yeah. Very fascinating.
The interesting thing is also the plot thickens because Madame Countess Tolstoy, Tolstoy's wife, had some kind of intimate relationship with the Russian composer Sergei Taneyev.
I didn't know that.
Who was a friend in the household, and there was always a suspected liaison between the two of them, which has something to do with the Kreutzer Sonata. Taneyev was himself a very wonderful composer and a conservative one. We did the Orchestra, as you know, his one big opera. But so there's a real life autobiographical aspect. And as you know, violinist and piano duets have always been sexualized. There used to be a perfume called My Sin by Lanvin. And this, if you go on the internet, you'll see there's a picture of a male violinist grabbing the female pianist into an embrace. So the violin as a seducer, you know, as the male, and the female as the pianist and the seducer. And this perfume, I don't think I'm making this up. I didn't dream it. But this you couldn't do this today, but I think this perfume still exists. It's called My Sin.
Yeah, Leon, I have to tell you, as the director of the conservatory, that never happens in the conservatory.
No, I know,
It never happens.
Right. And never at conservatory, although there must be some basis in experience for this. But in any event, the duet, the whole idea of this violin piano duet, which is a little different. I think probably bad things happen if you're playing four hands.
By design. That was by design. That I know.
By design.
You know, hands crossing over each other.
Right. Those are bad things.
Well, in a society where you could not touch a person easily of the other opposite sex, it's a way to do it in a safe way.
That's right.
Yeah.
And a trio, there's one too many people usually. But I think that the medium of the two instruments in the chord, would you think, Emmanuel, that the auditory difference or exchange between piano and violin in that sonata seems to about relationship, about communication, about tension, about attraction. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. You see, well, I'm not a musician, but I'm just saying what I feel, especially the beginning, this searching for each other, the violin, the piano, violin, like they, playing around, trying to find each other, and then boop, they run into the presto. I find that, very fascinating.
It's true. I never thought of that. I've coached these many times, but of course the violin starts solo, answered by the piano solo, and they never really join in that introduction. It is kind of back and forth until the beginning of the exposition. It's really fascinating. I want to open it up for some questions here that have come in, if you all can indulge me. So these are kind of random, but so here's a question from Gary Lockman. Wasn't Wellington's Victory originally written for a bizarre mechanical device and later arranged for orchestra? If so, by whom? And let's start there, and he has another question, which I'll ask after you answer that.
So, Christopher, this is some tied up with the inventor of the metronome.
Right. Yeah.
I guess this is with Mazel. And I have never been clear whether that he did create this mechanical device that did this or it didn't.
It was the idea for the panharmonicum.
Panharmonicum. Right.
The
same guy that invented the metronome, right?
Right. And some hearing devices for Beethoven to help, various types of listening horns and so forth. So the initial idea was to do this concert, to write for the panharmonicon, and that didn't work out, but Beethoven decided to write the piece with this idea of the battle and so forth, and they put on the concert together. It premiered the Seventh Symphony on the same concert. It led to them having a falling out.
Of course.
So yet again, because evidently the idea is really of using this tune and that tune and ending with God Save the King and even having the fugue and so forth had all been laid out for him. They did actually, though, sort of make up later, and hence the hearing aids that he helped to devise for Beethoven.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think that Gary's question is interesting because this is the heyday of what now are very treasured objects, which are these mechanical musical clocks that made bird song. There was a real fascination in the late 18th century with mechanical devices, often linked to time measurement, and metronome is a kind of time measurement device. And this was a rage for this kind of mechanical boxes of all kinds where things moved around and they were bejeweled and very valuable. There was a big traffic in this kind of contraption.
So on the concert that had Wellington's victory in the Seventh Symphony, there were 2 marches for mechanical trumpet, which was one of his devices.
Interesting. Amazing. Gary has an unrelated question, which is, did Beethoven arrange the Kreutzer for cello quintet? Emmanuel, do you know offhand, or Leon or Christopher?
Do what?
No, he didn't. He didn't. Someone did, but I don't.
Someone did. It wasn't him though. I see.
There are 2 arrangements. There's one for quintet, and then there's a later arrangement by a German musician for, I think it's piano quartet. So it's piano and a trio, piano, violin, viola, and there are 2 arrangements. There is but I don't think Beethoven has any. I was promised. We gave away some old music, Frank, at the Conservatory. Is that right?
Yes, we did.
And one of our faculty members picked it up, or Zach, one of the conductors picked it up and brought it backstage when we were for the concert. And I looked at it. It's by someone from Friedrich Hermann, arranged the piano quartet. And there is a quintet version without piano, I think.
Amazing.
But I don't think they're Beethoven's.
That whole idea of arranging pieces for other combinations is kind of a lost, it's a product of the 19th century.
But that was the culture of the
of
the time before recordings. And Beethoven did arrange, was it the Second Symphony for
string trio?
And that's, he really did that. And there are some other instances, but the publishers would churn these things out endlessly.
And then look, my God, we were subjected to the Beethoven Violin Concerto on the piano.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Here's a question from Joyce Landau. Did Beethoven say that Haydn never taught him anything? I don't remember hearing that.
So my impression is that Beethoven was a really, Emmanuel has taught many undergraduates, have you not? And he was also like you, was he not? Frank, did he not also go to Oberlin?
Yes, he did. We are fellow Oberlin
alumni, the competition. But so we are well aware that adolescents can be, not always respectful of authority. Right. So I think Beethoven said many different things, but I think it would be unfair to characterize the overwhelming weight of his response to Haydn was, I think, one of respect.
Interesting. Because I think there's an impulse also among some artists to want to seem like they come out of nothing. They're just arrive full blown without any training, and a gift from the gods. So fascinating. Here's another question, Leon, referring back to your perfume. Does the image of the violinist as male seducer go back to Paganini? That's actually a very good question. It may, in fact.
Emmanuel, let me turn that to you. Was Bridgetower a man about town?
About town?
No, was he a man about town? Was he a kind of a
womanizer or seducer?
Yes, he did. He was. That's why he was always with Beethoven, he was, how can I put it? He was charming, elegant, and while Beethoven, on the contrary, you know what he was. So yes, he was a seducer in a way, at least when he was in Vienna and Dresden.
So he's kind of an early version of Paganini in some ways.
Paganini, I think with Paganini and Bridgetower, the idea of the virtuoso as exotic. So what does male attractiveness in the early 19th century imply? Remember, this is a period when Byron, this is before the heavy-set, bearded idea of male maleness gets in the late 19th century. These are much more different types. Beethoven was exotic, as Bridgetower clearly was, and rebellious, which made him it was, you were breaking taboos, which was great, which can be very arousing to certain people. Beethoven has always had, there's a very good book for those of you who are interested, there's a very good book by Michael Broyles about the reception of Beethoven in America. And it's interesting that among the African-American community, there was a various ongoing speculation that Beethoven, because Emmanuel, of the von Beethoven and the West Indies connection, that he, and your point that he seemed black and swarthy, that somehow he was actually a black man, and therefore his exotic nature was like Pushkin. He was descended from blacks. I think that Malcolm X believed that for a while, and so did Stokely Carmichael. There's a long tradition of, because he was a rebel and fought against somehow strictures. So Paganini was much the same way. Paganini was not, he might have been attractive, but he was also the devil. He was also, remember, the violin is the instrument of the devil.
Yeah, true. Here's, let's see, we've got some nice questions coming in here. So this is a question for you, Emmanuel. This is actually a non-musical question, but it's about our current time. So Emmanuel, as an author, a scientist, an educator, and a music lover, during the pandemic, what music, literature, or other pursuits have sustained you during this time? What would you recommend to musicians to keep them, younger musicians, our musicians here in the Conservatory and the Orchestra now, to keep them motivated?
Well, I listen to lots of music online, of course. You see, there were many performances. Did you see this performance of the 9th of the, which was by the Dutch, I think by the Dutch. It is very moving. But I also listened to lots of jazz, because I'm a jazz fan too. And and of course I read a lots of fiction, short stories, and
who have you been reading, Emmanuel?
Well, I've been reading some author. I trying to catch up, but lots of French writers, African writers, and in the United States, I read also lots of non-fiction. So actually, it's very eclectic, you know, lots of things.
Wonderful. Let's see, here's some other questions. So Beethoven has been credited as a bridge composer between the classic and the Romantic periods. Do you see a particular point in the symphonies where he crossed this bridge?
Who, me?
Whoever. This is a question for
me.
No. Is there one particular symphony that marks a kind of...
Christopher, what do you say?
Well, I think for some of the reasons we were talking about, that the Eroica was the piece that did that through length, originality, difficulty, bizarreness, sublimity, you know, this idea of being entertained and so forth. The the contrast between the beautiful and the sublime is again the language that was being used at the time, in particular in relationship to this symphony.
Would you agree with that, Leon?
So I'm a little less persuaded by the presumption of the question. So I think there are two ways of thinking about Beethoven the way he's been understood. One is through the eyes of Richard Wagner. I think Wagner changes our view of Beethoven. So I can see this classic romantic distinction is less persuasive, because the first rage of romantic music and the first romantic embrace of music as the leading art already happens in the late 18th century. And you can look at the dissonant quartet of Mozart, or you can look at late Mozart and much of Haydn. So I could say you could take as a unit from Mozart and Haydn to Mendelssohn and Schumann. And that's a whole unit in which the center of which is Beethoven, right? And then there's a big break, and that break is kind of Liszt and Wagner in a way, late Liszt and Wagner. So I don't actually see Beethoven as a transition figure, no.
Interesting.
Because I think where it's headed, there's no home plate in Romanticism. There's no, the idea that there's a high classicism, you and I were taught the same stuff, then they derive the ideal sonata, and that must have been mid-period Beethoven sonata. You're the pianist, right? Not the Kreutzer Sonata, but some other sonata.
Right.
Then there's the ideal Beethoven. There's a kind of a Haydn symphony and a Mozart symphony that are put on a pedestal, and that's symphonic form, and they have this harmonic structure. I thought somebody invented this simply to oppress us as students. It just can't be right, And so, to me, Beethoven is a kind of natural. He doesn't seem so different from Mendelssohn and Schumann in a way. I mean, there are new things happen, but Chopin always strikes me as harmonically very ambitious, but conservative, tied more to Mozart than some other composer. I don't get it. I don't get this big difference.
Well, one of the great critics of the time, and also composer, and of course a writer like Emmanuel of fiction, E.T.A. Hoffmann, exactly talks the way that Leon does about this, that Haydn and Mozart are romantic composers. It's the word he uses. And the only thing he then does say is the person who really opened this all up and the full flowering is Beethoven. So, but he's pointing exactly to things in Mozart, in something like the G minor symphony, that for him is romanticism.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one piece that probably is, if you look at it as a mountain, right, going up to the mountain, going down to the mountain, the top of the mountain is probably the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven. And I think Christopher is right. H.R. Hoffmann's review of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven is kind of the centerpiece of the Romantic Manifesto. So you have Haydn and Mozart, and then it sort of culminates, and then it sort of subsides somewhere in the middle of the 19th century, and then you have a new kind of journey, which is I mean, I agree with you that maybe that's, yeah, go ahead.
It also depends how you define romanticism, of course. And, is it a formal thing? Is it about the kind of forms that were used, or is it about the relationship of the voice of the composer and, maybe that voice being more personal, more inward looking, more subjective rather than objective, which you might find in earlier times. But in that sense, Bach could be romantic, right? So
right. And something that Christopher mentioned, which is that suddenly listening to music was more than entertainment. And that's what strikes you with the Fifth Symphony. The Fifth Symphony really, I mean, you can't simply gossip during the Fifth Symphony. It's too like the Kreutzer Sonata. It's too mesmerizing. It's too out there. There's something assertive and mesmerizing.
Yeah, interesting. I don't see any more questions here, but there was one comment about the arrangement of the Violin Concerto for piano by pointing out that it was indeed by Beethoven, not a successful one, but the cadenzas were bizarre, and which I think we would all agree, which the cadenzas use timpani and they're very strange. But this person, Gary Lockman, points out that they were a model for Schnitge's equally bizarre cadenzas for the Violin Concerto.
I sort of like those cadenzas, but I'm curious, Frank, did you ever play this Beethoven concerto?
I never did. I have to look it up. I never did.
Did the Boston Symphony ever perform it? Do you ever remember?
No, they would never be that adventurous. I don't think. Don't quote me on that. No, I never heard.
Because one of my teachers,
they probably have done, but
one of my teachers, accompanists, was the very fine pianist Arthur Balsam.
Oh, right, of course.
And he recorded all the Haydn piano sonatas. He was and he somehow made a specialty of this, and of this piano concerto version of the Violin Concerto, which
it's kind of hard to imagine because the sonority of the Violin Concerto is so tied up with the violin. I would imagine, but
yeah, I mean, you asked a question, about bad Beethoven. So what's bad Beethoven? It is true that Beethoven sank to depth, so did Wagner, that other composers never did. Haydn and Mozart were incapable of writing bad music. They never, I think that's also true of Strauss, actually, but Beethoven and Wagner, certainly, the Centennial Overture, we talk about really bad, embarrassing. And we did the triple concerto in this Beethoven festival.
Yeah, beautiful. Actually, a great piece. Actually,
yeah, but it gets trashed. It does. The
unfairly.
Violin Concerto was totally considered second-tier Beethoven until Joachim made it a real vehicle. It was considered, not top drawer Beethoven. And there are those Irish, Scottish, so those, I don't know.
For piano trio and voice, yeah.
Yeah, there's some weird, and I've heard some really bad Beethoven where he's trying to be serious and doesn't make it. At least in Victory, he knows what he's doing.
There are a lot of those trio arrangements from Scottish songs, and there are a ton of them. But apparently they were quite influential on Beethoven's late period because they were very lyrical in style. I know Christopher.
I don't know them.
Yeah, no, there are, I think, 125, but it was a money-making deal. This publisher, Thompson in England, got it from Haydn as well. And
artists have to pay the mortgage, right? They have to pay the rent. So
but no, it's interesting. Beethoven is unpredictable. So he is one of the few people who takes the bait when Diabelli sends that waltz to make variations, and he writes one of his greatest pieces of all time, improbably. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Here's a wonderful comment here. Larry Wallach is pointing out that Peter Serkin played, and I didn't realize this, played and recorded the piano version of the Violin Concerto, and Christian Tetzov played the cadenza with timpani when he performed it with the BSO. And Emmanuel, I guess you heard that performance. That's what Larry Wallach is saying.
I'm not sure.
I mean, in other words, so the Schnitke, I think I heard a broadcast of some kind of American performance of the Violin Concerto with the Schnitke cadenza with timpani. That must be that, right?
Probably. Christian Tetzov, it sounds like something he might do.
Yes.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Now, Beethoven didn't write a cadenza for the Violin Concerto, so this is the closest we get. And the idea of transcribing the piano cadenza for violin and the interjection of the timpani, which is sort of amusing.
Actually, the standard concerto cadenzas for that concerto, I think, appropriately Joachim's, because he was a tireless defender of this concerto and really propelled it back,
in,
the violin.
like the Brahms concerto. Yeah, similar.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so maybe some closing thoughts about this program and about the year. I just wanted to thank Leon for everything you've done with the orchestra to help them perform. And it's a wonderful way to close with this really rich program. Thank you for everything you've done. Christopher, thank you for everything. Emmanuel, thank you for your contributions. I really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Frank, for being terrific, and was this the first year of our new dean or the second?
This is the second year, but it's hardly it's a strange second year. So
and also for shepherding this thing. It's been very hard, but what we've learned from the pandemic is how much we miss music in real space and real time.
I think that for me, at least, one thing that has really been brought home by the pandemic is the power of in-person music making, and the really the human contact that you get from hearing a live sweating musician perform something. I think it really, I'm hopeful that we will retain this in the future, and that we will, value it even more as this pandemic ends.
Music can't be recorded. When you hear live the three soloists in the triple concerto play together, you think, my God, humans must have redeeming features if they could invent doing this. You know what I mean? Don't you think, Emmanuel? For all the terrible aspects of human nature, the capacity to invent music has to be a redeeming feature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you think when you really listen to it, sometimes you say, you're not going to die.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, well, it's been a really, really wonderful year, and this is a great way to close. I know the students are extremely excited about this concert, and really thrilled to be playing it. I'm looking forward to hearing Wellington's victory in person.
It should be something that should be, outdoors, and
Probably.
yeah.
Great.
In a football.
Well, thank you all for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Frank.
You're welcome. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Leon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.